welcome to our Nurturing Safe and Responsive Campus Communities for Survivors of Sexual Violence. This will be our education panel for the Creating Transformative Systems Conference, and we are so grateful to have you here. My name is Natalie Akel. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the prevention specialist at NJ CASA, the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I will be providing an image description. So I am a cisgendered, light-skinned brown woman with dark curly hair. I'm wearing a black turtleneck, and I have a blurry background behind me with some blurred paintings of various sizes. Our panelists, would you like to give your image descriptions? And then I can go into our introductions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Colome. I use she, her pronouns as well as Aya. I am a white cisgender woman joining you with dark brown curly hair, a relatively dark green top, and what you see around me is a white office. On my left, your right, it may look like a bookshelf, and on my right, your left, likely a desk and some wall artwork. Very excited to be here with you today.
Tanji, would you like to go next?
My name is Tanji Reese. I am a lighter skinned Black woman with medium length black braids. I have on white glasses and long earrings. I am wearing an olive green shirt and my background is blurry, but you can see small patches of artwork and the outline of my gray chair behind me.
And Jennifer.
Hello, my name's Jennifer Nacarelli. I am a cisgendered petite Italian woman with long dark hair, olive skin. I'm wearing a white turtleneck with a blue and white striped blazer. My background is the background for my professional organization, the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence at the University of Delaware. It's navy blue with the UD logo and white writing.
Thank you so much for each and every one of you for being here. And before we move into our questions, I'm going to be reading a short description and introduction of our panelists today. And so we'll start with Jennifer Nacarelli. She is the Associate Chair and an Associate Professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Delaware. Additionally, she is the founding director and co-director of the Center for the Study and Prevention of Gender-Based Violence. She teaches, researches, publishes, and designs curriculums and field experiences in the field of gender-based violence. Welcome, Jennifer. Moving on to Sarah Colome. With over a decade in the movement to end violence, Sarah has bolstered the capacity of organizations as a strategist, trainer, consultant, advocate, and educator. Her experience spans sectors, including roles as a national technical assistance provider, director of a university prevention and advocacy resource center, and an organizational development consultant. She founded Collective Futures LLC in 2021 to partner with clients in not only visualizing, but actualizing intersectional equity through individual and organizational transformation. Welcome, Sarah. And Tanji Reese. Tanji is an interpersonal violence advocate and preventionist from Detroit with over 13 years of experience at the local, state, and national levels. Inspired by Black feminist thought leaders, she has a mission to center wellness and healing in prevention while being grounded in an intersectional approach. With this mindset and a wealth of passion, she founded her organization 1124, which aims to prevent interpersonal violence by providing youth education and capacity building for adults. Awesome. Welcome. Thank you. Honestly, this is a privilege to be hosting this conversation. I'm so excited. So we will be going into our questions now. Our first question will be directed towards all the panelists to answer. We know that sexual violence and harm rooted in oppression are prevalent on college campuses. We also know that oftentimes administrations stay silent or issue performative responses following instances of violence and harm on campus unless students demand more. This places the responsibility on students to call out injustice, which can disrupt students' emotional, physical, and academic well-being. This also creates feelings of an unsafe campus environment. Why is this culture so pervasive on campuses? And can you speak to how it is influenced by a widespread systemic oppression?
I believe that the culture of campuses are a direct reflection of the world outside of campuses. And that's because they still hold on to a lot of the white dominant practices that are built the foundation of our country. So there is a culture of exclusivity, privilege, and informal systems of support that only benefit a select few of people. And so accountability really looks one-sided, where the institution is always going to be protected. And institutions are protected because of the longevity, because of racism, and a lot of times because of money. And I believe that institutions are all aware that a student's time on campus is limited to maybe 4 or 5 years. And the culture of campus can outlive the students who are actually attending during that time. So systemic oppression is built on those same values, most of which contribute to the racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and other inequities. So the systemic oppression that we see on college campuses are directly intersected with wealth gaps, unemployment, and housing. So we're seeing a lot of parallels within community. And also these systems of oppression thrive because it's set up for the institution to make it thrive. Also on many campuses, there's an understanding of safety that is different for students. For them, safety and well-being for campuses, it can mean a blue light, campus police, maybe a violence prevention center. But just like in community, violence prevention centers, women's centers, LGBTQ centers, multicultural centers, and counseling services are underfunded. They're threatened to be shut down. They don't exist. So inevitably, students who are on the margins don't get to seek the safety on campus and are often have to fight twice as hard to be valued or heard. And I think this continues to happen because some students who are organizers don't always have the support of folks who are in power or even potential allies that exist on campus that may be afraid or unwilling to support them or speak out against some of the cultures that are harmful.
Tanji, you laid out such a strong foundation to this very heavy question. And I would just add, I think quite transparently, it's because most campuses prioritize liability above all else, and that includes our students. It's not all campuses, but it's a common trend that we see, particularly in terms of the work that we all do. So the risk of lawsuits, losing donors, and hits to an institution's reputation is what drives decision making. It's capitalism at work, and we know this country's capitalist system was built through racism, trafficking, enslavement, and sexual exploitation. Institutions of higher education aren't separated from that history, as Tanji laid out. So these institutions also weren't established for or with marginalized students in mind, and particularly students of color. We see this through the posturing, lack of accountability for individual or system-based harm. And as Tanji laid out, like the frequent insufficient staffing, funding, and support for spaces and initiatives that are aimed at supporting and celebrating students of color, as well as in intersecting survivors. So I think that this continued institutional abandonment really contributes to and perpetuates the challenges that advocates have in preventing sexual misconduct, or the term that you use on your campus, as well as supporting students of color, whether they're survivors or not. So for me, I think this is why it's really imperative that our initiatives are grounded in the understanding that the work of preventing and responding to sexual misconduct is liberation work, and thus inherently the work of racial justice. And I don't see a lot of spaces where we're truly equipping each other to speak to that interconnection. And many times we're punishing the ones who speak up or weaponizing the language of liberation and intersectionality. So investing in that learning and training is essential. And while that does mean money, I think it also means much more. So thinking about cross-training, deep partnership, and mentorship, because the premise of keeping us separated and making these siloed initiatives and siloed movements for justice is just uplifting that system of oppression that you're asking us about now.
Building upon the themes that Tanji and Sarah elevated, when we think about how we're going to transform certain institutions, we have to think about how these institutions came to be and were formed. And systemic oppression, power over, structural inequality is woven into the foundational fabric of our educational systems in general and university settings in particular. From the lands that were taken from indigenous populations to build our campuses upon, from the labor and economic systems through enslavement that constructed them, to the dualistic and racist ideologies that form the basis, the foundation of our systems of knowledge, these common assumptions of mind being valued over body, male over female, the rationale of colonialism and enslavement, the literature we choose that forms our canon, the histories of denying access to groups of people. This is the ground that we stand upon. So when we work to transform it, we've got to go deep and acknowledge that historical context. I think Tanji summarized beautifully how the campus is a microcosm of broader society. That's another factor at play. We know that these forms of oppression, such as sexism, racism, sexual violence, they're probably going to be experienced more acutely, or at least be more concentrated and potent in this setting. And we also have to remember as we go to transform that these institutional settings really vary greatly. It's difficult to discuss college in general or university life in general. Are we picturing a small liberal arts school or a massive R1 state school? Are we in an urban, rural, commuter residential environment? Different communities have varying mechanisms for both prevention and for response. So environment matters greatly in terms of opportunity, prevalence, institutional response to violence and harm. And the question at hand is how to ensure that the foundational priority of anti-oppression, the foundational priority of safety and anti-violence is sustained despite these shifting contexts, these shifting capacities and resources for our young adults. And let's not forget about young adults. They are in a particular developmental phase of life where identity formation is crucial. They're exploring, they're making choices, they're defining their sense of self, their place in the world. They're building this sense of self and new identity by responding to or integrating the cultural norms of their given context. And that context, as we already laid out, is fraught with conditions of inequality. Also, in this developmental phase, we see a dominance of groupthink, of risk-taking behaviors. And that groupthink is really related to the tolerance and the acceptability of sexual violence that's informed by the gender norms and racial bias, past experiences of privilege and trauma that the students bring with them here. So this is where early interventions, such as comprehensive sex education, inclusive and historically accurate curriculums, they're crucial to what the folks are bringing with them to this space. So, this is a location that's steeped in inequality, but to do the work, I really believe it's a location for great hope and has great potential for transformation. And we can access emerging thinkers and their solutions here, but we've got to build in the diversity, the representation, the voice, and cultivate a sense of belonging if that hope is ever going to be realized.
Jennifer, you shared something that I was really grateful that you talked about the diversity of different kinds of campuses. And so thinking about the question you asked us, Natalie, I'm also thinking about our HBCUs, our HSIs, and our tribal colleges. and how, while related, some of these experiences around oppression might look different. Obviously, there are still marginalized populations within those campuses, but those campuses in particular are also susceptible in a different and deeper way to oppression and systemic oppression at large, in the ways that those universities are or are not supported financially or otherwise. And I think we're seeing that right now in a national context, in particular states where those universities and colleges are really being targeted, both right now, and we're seeing the pattern of systemic lack of investment, whether that's funding, advocacy, or otherwise. And so I know for me, it's always something I have to remind myself is, we can't be centering whiteness, so it's not just PWIs, but also thinking about how oppression lives within, as Tanji was saying, like within the institution as a reflection of the community, but it's also the systems that feed into these institutions that are directly related to the power and control that I'm pretty confident that we're all committed to addressing.
That moves us really well into our next question, which is first directed towards Tanji. On predominantly white campuses, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC students may not feel a sense of belonging or connection to campus violence prevention initiatives. Could you share some insights into the methods and approaches you have employed to engage BIPOC students in dialogue, healing, and community building around sexual violence prevention?
Yeah, and I just want to say too, from the last question, thanks again, Sarah, for uplifting HBCUs and other culturally specific institutions that have often been underfunded and undervalued. And the reason why some of our work is around looking at Black students on predominantly white institutions is that that sense of belonging has to be created in such a deeper way because of not having a lot of those cultural connections that are there. So what we know is that 1 in 4 Black girls will experience sexual violence before 18. So that means that for many Black students, they're already survivors before entering college. And so through 1124, we started working with an institution to fill those gaps between that conventional prevention education programs often miss out and really because they're not always centering the experiences of young Black people. So we created a program called the Clearing Ground, and it serves as a way to foster a connection and a sense of belonging for Black students on predominantly white campuses, and especially spaces where they might not feel as connected to prevention initiatives. And the reason why we chose a Clearing Ground is based off of a quote from Toni Morrison's Beloved. And she says, "The clearing ground is a wide open place cut deep in the woods. Nobody knew for at what end the path known, only the deer and whoever created the land in the first place. This is a place where the flesh weeps, we laugh, we dance, and bare feet in grass, and we love it." So she looks at the clearing ground as a space for Black folks to come together, to share space, to be able to cry and laugh. And what we learned through our work is that this is something that the students needed. So the project was created in 2020. We were in a partnership with Northern Kentucky University in their Violence Prevention Center and also their Office of African American Student Initiatives. And so we created it with Black feminist thought principles in mind, and with the intent, again, to bridge that gap between Black students and those violence prevention initiatives. And we wanted to really center dialogue, experiences, accountability, and care. When we started and we learned is that a lot of Black students had experienced violence. About 25% of Black students had experienced sexual violence or relationship abuse on their campus, or they had a friend that did. 0 students went to the Violence Prevention Center and this was advocacy and violence prevention. So the center was very aware, like, we know that this is happening with Black students and students of color, but nobody is really coming in here. So that's where we kind of came in and offer some support and capacity building about first figuring out why this is, really going through a discovery process. And then secondly, figuring out what are some options and things that we can do. So what we did was have a series of some roundtables, and they were listening sessions initially to get information. But And this was also during the pandemic, so they had to be virtual. So that was also a way for us to engage students who were new to campus, who had never really met other folks who are on campus, including freshman students. And so from there, and that discovery process, we started to learn more about what students need were. Like I mentioned earlier, the understanding of safety totally was transition. Safety for Black students on campus meant something totally different. Well-being and justice meant something that was totally different to them than their white counterparts, because we were also having conversations with peer ambassadors and the violence prevention staff too. So from that discovery process, what we found is that students really learned a whole lot about relationships and sexual violence from their families, but still also were held to what their families were thinking and wanted to do what they could to support their families. A lot of them felt like they were like breaking generational trauma trends that were a part of their family, with also the weight of just trying to show up as a student. So because of that, there was like this deep reverence for the Black community. So even when harm happened between Black students and within the Black community, they were not always willing to report, which again is a direct reflection and parallel to what we see in community, where we are like protective of people. We have like codes of silence that we abide by, and we aren't always willing to go outside of our community to seek care and support. And students were doing the same exact thing. We also saw a deep desire for mental health support. A lot of students were like, I need this support, but I don't even feel comfortable. But a lot of it comes from like stigmas behind getting outside care. So again, just as like Black folks in community are having these same experiences, and we see in community this same type of struggle to get folks connected to resources, college students, what we noticed on this campus in particular, but not even just this campus, because other places we work with, we were hearing some of the same things. Students were having this experience. So after this discovery process, which was really for recommendation, which was one, there are no Black advocates in this office. And so when students are coming into the office, are they seeing any kind of representation? And not just advocates, but peer ambassadors. So if you're having on a white campus, an all white office, Black students aren't feeling comfortable going into that space. So part of that was hiring a Black advocate, but also equipping Black leaders and to be able to support students if they had experienced trauma, making sure that referral connection was very clear so that we're all working together. But then the other charge for the office was you got to show up for the students, because the only thing they were asking is, can you come to our event? Can you show up in our spaces and feel comfortable doing that, so that we don't always feel like we have to come to you? So after that, the students also said, we need more of these spaces. So some of the conversations we initially talked about were media literacy, what prevention looks like, how we can provide support and care to each other. We had a group that was only for men. And then after that, they requested to have a group around body autonomy. And so looking at body autonomy as like that foundation to understand what consent is, because if you know, just historically with Black folks not having ownership over our bodies, and Black and Indigenous and folks of color not having ownership over our bodies, we can't really talk about consent in an honest way if this is what our base level is. So we started that conversation talking about body autonomy, making choices about it. And I remember in particular, one person brought up, I don't like that I have to choose between food and getting a sanitary napkin or doing anything for my sanitary needs. I don't like to have to make these kind of choices. So this was our open space. This was our clearing ground to be able to talk about these things. But we also invited staff, faculty, alumni to be a part of these conversations too. Once in 2022, when we came on campus, it was different, right? Because we were virtual at first, and then everybody's back on campus, whole new group of students, except for one. She came to every single roundtable we've had. But we started off promoting it, and 3 white students showed up to the event. We were like, all right, what are we doing? That's not working. So we really start to work in conjunction with students to have other folks show up. And now we have an average of about 20 students that show up every month to our roundtables. And we talk about things like family relationships, identity affirmation, our community vision for prevention. We talk about faith and consent and spirituality, Black love in the media. And our next one in March is around Afrofuturism. And so our hope is that, and so what we also see, and since we've had this space, one of the students, he came to one because that was another trend that we saw, as we saw more Black male students coming in, feeling like they can be a part of prevention programming, which is really a difference from what society tells us about Black men when it comes to sexual violence. It's the thought is that Black men don't get involved and Black men don't care, but we were seeing the exact opposite. And so one of the students, he said, like, I know we talk about trauma, but what do we do about it? Like, what can we do? And so we started talking to him about the office, the violence prevention office, but also peer ambassadors. And he, along with 2 other Black students, decided to become peer ambassadors. And since then, they have been recruiting more Black students to be peer ambassadors so that in the community and with their friend groups, with folks they already work with, they can. He was also a member of a Divine Nine fraternity, and he was the president of the student government. So he was someone who had power, understood the power and privilege he had as the student body president, but also is really dedicated to being a peer ambassador and being able to have conversations. So that was another change we saw, is that once we started to create this space, students started requesting their own roundtables. So we had like the Kappas, they wanted to have a roundtable on consent. We had another like Black Women's Honorary Society. They wanted to talk about Sisters of the Yam, and we had a listening party listening to Jasmine Sullivan. So we try to bring in culture as much as we can, but we feed them, which is also thankful for grant funding that allows us to feed students, but we offer them a meal. But we really create like the space where low prevention happens around our kitchen table, at our family reunions, with our folks. We try to create that space for students. And right now, what we're working on is sustainability. So preparing and prepping the leadership teams and the folks who are leading some of these offices of support on how they can keep this going, even if we're not on the campus. So yeah, that's some of the work that we're doing.
Oh, thank you, Tanji. That was such a wonderful response. I wish you could all hear me being my snaps and my like it's so wonderful hearing how inspiring. Jennifer or Sarah, would you like to add anything to this question?
Sure. It's so interesting. Tomji, the work that you've done sounds really similar to what we did on another campus, and I'm so happy to hear that it worked well in the spaces that you've been. So Collective Futures really focuses on like helping folks get out of their way to create transformative change. And that is really based on a lot of the experiences that I've had. So one of the things that really helped us to center and meet the needs of BIPOC students was being in deep relationship with the folks who already had trusted relationships with those students. So the most recent campus I was on, the Women's Resources Center, was located within the same subdivision as the Cultural and Resource Centers. Now, lots of campuses don't have resource centers or cultural centers, but you may have like individuals dedicated to serving these communities or unofficial groups that are. And so doing our own work to build trust there, to do the self-reflection, and we did similar things. So focus groups, and I would add informal and formal conversations with the folks that are serving those communities as well. We had the benefit of being new when we came in. So difficult feedback was maybe a little easier to give because they knew that it wasn't like myself and my team who were the ones had perhaps caused some of that tension. But there were still things that we needed to reconcile. And so because of those conversations, what we ended up doing was creating something that we call the embedded model. And so in very close partnership primarily with the La Casa Cultural Latina at the University of Illinois. And then later we expanded to the Bruce D. Nesbitt African American Cultural Center. We created this model to more strategically meet students of color where they are. So in our experience at the campus that we were at, people had trusted relationships with individuals in the resource center, but not necessarily the prevention and advocacy program at large. And so what we did, and it's much more detailed, but essentially we worked with these folks to create truly embedded relationships. So kind of stepping beyond the, hey, we come in once a week and we sit at a table, and if you have a question or you need a bag of condoms, you can come up and get it. But regularly being in this space. And that meant everything from informal conversations about sex and dating and family and anything else that was going on with students to more formal partnerships. And by being in this space, it also demanded our advocates to be an integrated part of the community. Some of the advocates shared the identity of the cultural center and some didn't. And so that also put a lot of responsibility to self-reflection, unlearning, coaching, and supervision. And one of the ways that we did that so that it wasn't taking space that taking unintentional or intentional space that wasn't ours was from the beginning working with those cultural centers to recruit, interview, hire, onboard, and to some extent some shared supervision and accountability to make sure that the presence there was contributing and not detracting, and not taking space but contributing to the space.
I'm just so encouraged by the focus on the context of discovery, because that's really what higher education is all about. And all of these techniques about formal and informal listening sessions, the absolute requirement to build trust over time to enable that discovery to take place. It's just the heart of what an institution of higher learning should do. Tonji brought up the practice of showing up for our students, particularly our marginalized students' events. It's not enough to just schedule them, grant the space, grant the capacity for advertising to circulate the flyers in your classrooms, but to really show up, because showing up teaches everyone in our community that we have something to learn. Everybody has a body of knowledge to communicate. And we do this in formal ways and informal ways. I teach a feminist research methods class that very much elevates the experience of marginalized people as the experts in their own experience, and that's real knowledge. That's the generation of knowledge in the academy. So often marginalized people who have been excluded from the building of knowledge, they've been excluded from the structures that validate that knowledge to be true, that enable that knowledge to be circulated and gain audience, and then gain the authority and privileges associated with disseminating that knowledge and enjoying the benefits of being the owner of knowledge. Showing up in those spaces says, you know, we believe that you are a knowledge creator, and by being a knowledge creator, you belong in this academy. So those spaces and attendance, as well as representation, is just so important for cultivating self-efficacy in students. And it's just critical.
Thank you so much for all your responses. We can move on to the next question unless there's any final thoughts. So Sarah, how do you operationalize non-performative, student-centered policies and practices in the context of responding to sexual violence? What efforts need to be taken to better support survivors? And what does transformative accountability look like on campuses?
A few of the things that come up for me is authentic student-centered approaches really requires intention, self-reflection, and emergence. I think that the concept of student-centeredness is still something that gets weaponized a lot. We say that we do it. And I can think of a time where I sat down with students and I said, you know, we're going to talk about some of the frameworks that we use at the Women's Resources Center. I'm sure that you've heard about these in other spaces. And so when we went through intersectionality, Black feminist thought, trauma-informed praxis. When we got to student-centeredness, I said, who's heard of this before? And a handful of them like raised their hands. And I said, great, like how has it ever been explained to you? And there was silence. And it wasn't that they didn't know how to recall it. It's that no one had ever said, and when we say this is important to us, this is what it means. And so for us, it was really important to sit down and say, all right, we say this thing. That means that we're also inviting you to hold us accountable to it. And in addition to that, when we're employing this, it means we really do want your opinions. I want to know what looks good to you as well as what does not resonate with you. I want to know where we're completely missing the mark, where there's an opportunity that we may not see because we're not students, and where you need us to show up more, the same, or differently. And so sometimes I think because of the way that ageism shows up, and Jennifer talked a little bit about this just a minute ago, it's really important that we as practitioners are explicitly inviting that back and then giving the patience and time to build trust for students to believe that we will practice what we preach. For a lot of campuses, our approaches to students to survivor support, is still rooted in the needs of white, cis, able-bodied women, often with a multitude of other privileged identities like lobbed on top. These students obviously deserve support and safety. However, when our approaches are crafted and implemented with them as the baseline, we intrinsically miss the needs of marginalized survivors like students of color, LGBT students, disabled students, and male survivors as well. Chris Linder talks about a power conscious framework, and that was really important for me and our team as we were creating the embedded model I was just speaking about, as well as just our general approach. We also saw that students weren't coming into the space in a way that reflected the diversity of campus. And I mean diversity in all aspects of that. So for us, it was important that we addressed that. And I think in general, as a field, our prevention and advocacy work must truly start from an anti-oppression lens if we want to better support students and not just be an add-on at the end of our design. Okay, we created this thing based on the general knowledge that we have. Hey, Black students, does this look okay to you? That's not being student-centered. And so thinking about how we need to redesign our own processes to really be centering the students that we say that we want to, let alone students in general, because oftentimes policies and response processes are rooted in what I was saying earlier, are rooted in liability. And we need to comply with law, but we also need to be thinking about how are we still making sure that students are getting what they need? And then the way that we create policies and processes isn't meeting the needs of the folks that those laws were theoretically created for in the first place. So practically, that often means that we need to decenter ourselves, which is easy to say and often hard to do. And you may, like I said earlier, need to prove that you're going to practice what you preach before students are willing to believe it. So for example, like how are we relaying what role students are going to have in terms of decision making? If we have them sit down and look at something, if we have them sit down to talk to us about what it is that we need, or the ways that policies and processes are either confusing or not working, are we planning on doing anything with that? Or are we having the conversation to say we had the conversation? And operationally, that means that meetings might need to be at non-traditional times and places. We might need to get out of our own way and decenter ourselves and be creative, because students aren't going to come to an 8 a.m. meeting. And anything at night on a Thursday through a Sunday, like good luck with that. Sometimes it happens, but especially if it's a meeting where we're not outlining like, this is why it's important that you're here, and this is how we're going to make sure that we actually respond to what you're saying. It's performative. It's not actually centering their experiences and getting out of our own ways. Because ultimately, not listening to those students, we're going to be putting all of this work into adjusting perhaps a new federal policy or creating a prevention initiative that doesn't land, that we get maybe 2 people to respond to, and then we get frustrated. So again, where are we starting? And privilege also shows up in which and how students are able to participate. Tanji talked a little bit earlier about how like basic needs often like bump up against a lot of the work that we're trying to do. So what efforts are we making to broaden our reach and partnership beyond the students who are easier to access, who have the privilege to not have to worry about their basic needs, about where they're going to get food, about, well, I'd really love to be involved in this, but I have an internship and 3 part-time jobs because that's the only way that I can pay for school, let alone support the family that they may need to be supporting, or any other multitude of basic needs that they need to cover, because they don't have the same level of privilege as other students. So are they involved at the start rather than for a final sign-off? And since we're going to be facing some new policy changes, I really urge folks to be thinking about um, having students as a very concentrated part of that process. So, for example, are your policies buried in unnecessary legalese? Is there a way to still meet what you need to do and make it easier for folks to understand? And then also, where is the primary information students need? So, are you burying at the bottom of a policy where confidential resources are? Are you even clarifying the difference between Title IX's confidentiality, advocate confidentiality, and community advocate confidentiality, if you're privileged enough to have all 3 of those resources? How are we making that clear? Because if the policy is really there to outline how to access things and the steps to take, the people we're creating them for need to be able to follow that. I want to give a chance for the other folks to talk, but I want to talk really quickly about transformative accountability, because I think that's a really important question that you raised. Transformative accountability really calls us to look beyond a carceral approach and embrace a relational accountability to create something new. I think it's important that we're distinguishing between restorative and transformative justice, or accountability, even though they're intrinsically connected. Our approaches to transformative accountability have to keep in mind that we're still working within those structures we talked about at the beginning that will inherently resist, water down, and perhaps even co-opt that approach. Now, there's some campuses that are really exploring different ways to incorporate restorative justice practices on campuses. And I think the next logical step is relaying this approach to non-institutional spaces. So to be frank, many communities of color already use these practices to some extent because they can't rely on our criminal legal system. But how can we intentionally build capacity in our communities to employ these practices, whether we're in the room or not? This really calls us to consider the community at large and not just where our campus boundaries end. So in terms of those approaches, what does education and engagement look like for those who are using harm? How are we connecting conversations about consent, bodily autonomy, and healthy relationships back to shared values? And are we centering the safety and well-being of survivors without discarding those who are causing harm? I'm not suggesting that we ignore accountability and safety needs, but it does require us to interrogate the disposability we've been trained to rely on, which is inherently racist and ableist, and a number of other intersecting forms of oppression. And furthermore, how are we equipping our educators and our administrators to have these conversations? We have to be able to hold the humanity of each other while we're calling for us to be the best versions of ourselves.
I just wanted to add, because thank you, Sarah, for raising up too, just like the role of like police and security, and how sometimes those coordinated response teams are perpetuating some of the harmful oppression that students are experiencing on a daily basis. So disclosing something like sexual violence is not always helpful, but at the same time, some of the modalities around healing are often shunned. Like it's like a strong concentration on like talk therapy and counseling and advocacy, where that doesn't always work for certain students. So I think there also has to be some flexibility around what that supports for survivors look like that goes outside of some of the mainstream practices that we're used to.
Yes, Jennifer, and then we can move right on.
When we talk about student-centered initiatives, like the beautiful ones that Sarah described, and we think about things that are non-performative, this is something I grapple with. It's the problem of exploitation of our students. We're inviting them really accurate, based on my experience, accurate assessment of how to capture the feedback of the students and to elevate their voices in times and meeting patterns and structures. But the reality is we're asking them for the information we need and the energy and the time to transform the institution that they are a paying client of. And that comes at a very real cost. And I see this time and time again. When students are engaged in the protest of a particularly egregious moment in time, I see their attendance and their ability to pay attention to the obligations of their job and their coursework sort of suffer. And this is real. And then the campus institutional response is to engage them in listening sessions and to hear from the students and let them know their voices are heard. But the students aren't earning any compensation for that feedback. They're not earning academic credit for their feedback. This participation is not going to put them in a position to compete for jobs or graduate school or scholarships. Yes, it might inform an essay or content, but it's not institutionally based. So when we utilize students to transform the institution that they are a client of, we have to be really purposeful in how they get paid. Because be clear, this is a market. And they should be getting paid with academic credits. They should be getting paid with access to special experiences that position them for further access after graduation, instead of just extracting all of their labor and their energy and their mobilization to say, oh, we checked a box. So I'm very sensitive to how we utilize and capture student-centered feedback in a way that sets them up for further opportunities.
That honestly goes right into your question, Jennifer, and I will read the last question as well so that we, after you respond, please feel free to unmute and share any final thoughts. So, Jennifer, how do campuses move beyond being reactive when incidents occur and move towards an investment in meaningful prevention and fostering a safer campus? How do we make sexual violence prevention and ending rape culture a priority for all campus stakeholders? And just to follow up, and I can put it in the chat, our final question, which you've all been speaking to, I believe, is what potential do college campuses have to be a source of change in the bigger picture of liberation from sexual violence?
We need to make this fight against sexual violence, this fight against racism, we need to build it into all of the other current crises that are facing institutions of higher education. We can't pretend that our administrators and our leaders are going to elevate this problem unless they see how it's connected to all of the other problems that they are facing. So right now, we know that if things feel difficult to navigate in higher education, it's because they are. And we've got some real problems that we have to confront. We've got a general lack of public trust in the value of a college education. We have folks questioning if it's worth it. We have problems with affordability. We have problems demonstrating a return on investment. We have political interference with our curriculums. We saw this week clearly in the state of Florida, but we've got political interference with our majors, our minors, our programs, departments, our co-curricular programs. This has real implications for our anti-racist gender equity work. The reality is we are facing what we call an enrollment cliff. And everybody's talking about it. In 2026, just based on sheer demographics, we're going to see declining enrollments in higher education. What problems has that caused now? Well, now we're all preparing, right? And now we're over enrolling in preparation of the enrollment cliff. So this puts strains on housing. This puts strains on class sizes, on student services, on GBV services. We're still in post-COVID recovery. We're not done yet. We're facing real financial struggles related to that. We've lost a tremendous amount of momentum and institutional memory because of the layoffs that took place when we went into lockdown. And we lost relationships, and we're still coming back from that. And that really is related to our prevention work. That's related to our intervention services. Now we've got a new one, and the rise of AI and its implications for how we structure our classrooms, how we quote police students, how we embrace it or challenge it. And then, you know, we've always been in this constant cycle of crisis response, the horrible case of intimate partner violence, of sexual violence, the horrible case of racism, the protests, the elections, the conflicts, the speakers, the financial crisis, the strikes. Okay, so this puts more structured plans like prevention work on the back burner all the time if we're always in a state of response. So what we've got to do is integrate the prevention work and these initiatives into all of the different challenges facing higher education. So I think that's one real way that we can respond to this really important historical moment in time, because I guarantee things are definitely going to look fundamentally different in a decade in our higher ed institutions. So we got to plan ahead with this prevention work. And, you know, a decade ago, those of us experienced a real heyday where all of a sudden the work of 2 decades before, our institutions were like, oh yeah, we're gonna give a lot of visibility and resources to our sexual violence prevention and intervention programs. The flourishing after the Dear Colleague letter and the White House Task Force and the think tank and the Prevent Connect scan, you know, we were cooking. And it felt good, and it felt like we were finally building some momentum. And then that kind of came to a big halt with the Trump administration. And then everybody stalled their momentum, deciding what institutional changes needed to be implemented, if at all. And that moment in time kind of solidified our response. Sarah was talking about this. Our responses shifted from innovation and transformation to compliance and to legality, and that fulfilled the role of sexual violence prevention and intervention services. So we got to get out of this. We're still not at capacity, and we got to resustain the focus and respond to all of those higher ed contexts. So what do we do? I recommend that when we envision prevention work on a campus, we have to problematize the role of the stakeholder. The first step to most of our prevention activities is identify your campus stakeholders and engage them in the conversation. Listen to them, make them see it's important. We've got a lot wrong with our stakeholders. Many of them, it's not the prime function of their job. They see this as a distraction from the crisis response that flares up from time to time. Again, our leaders and our staff positions are experiencing high turnover and institutional memory. All of these trust relationships, many of them have been severed, and overemphasis on their part on compliance. Be real, a very real lack of expertise in trauma and gender equity and racial equity and what that means beyond these words. There's a fundamental lack of expertise on some folks who are charged with making decisions about this work. And our advocates are overburdened with the support services. They haven't really in general been staffed up, but they're the ones who have the expertise and often the institutional memory. When our campus leaders, when administrators are given decision-making authority over the advocates who actually do the work, we've got a problem. They're not given equal voice on par with lawyers and administrators, presidents, provost, deans, and the like. So when we talk about the stakeholder, getting them to the table is really just a real tiny piece of the work. I think I'm concerned with decision makers' limited expertise most of all right now. And I don't think that expertise is going to be cultivated and developed unless sexual violence prevention work becomes a primary deliverable for their positions. So it has to be built into everybody's workload obligations, and doing so in a way that doesn't stop at superficial compliance. So compliance brings some stakeholders to the table, but not with the expertise that they need. And then balance of power tips over to the admin and overshadows the expertise of folks who really know it. So we got to figure out ways when we're sitting at the table to distribute power and share power and expertise of those who have it. As I said, prevention must be a prime central deliverable to their role. And it's not just about creating this team, right? Somebody in charge has to charge the team. We need formal charges from our boards and from our presidents that says to their unit leaders and everybody under them. I know I sound like a bureaucrat, but we're talking about navigating a hierarchy here. And people have to be told it's part of their workload for them to care and for them to really invest in a deliverable that is sustainable. So central admin and unit leaders must issue a charge. They must declare it a priority, and we can help articulate why it's a priority in terms of all those other problems that the university system is facing. So the promise, I believe, of environmental situational prevention, it's really real and it's really exciting. But it has to come with a restructured campus workforce that is yet to be realized. So it's not about identifying and getting them there, but we really have to strategize about how we can convince them that it is in the stakeholders' interest, and use their sphere of influence to champion sexual violence prevention. So we really can't ignore this. And I think that's the next step to sort of implementing in the bureaucracy of higher education these amazing, promising principles of situational prevention.
So much, Jennifer. And we somehow are at the end of the panel, but before we close up, I do want to give Tanji and Sarah a chance to respond or share closing thoughts.
So many things to say, but I'm three kind of like final thoughts that I want to leave folks with. And I know we're going to have a Q&A as well. So happy to expound or be a thought partner for any of these. I'm merging the two last questions. So thinking about the role campuses can have, we have an immense amount of resources, and the movement is not just on our campuses. We are seeing crisis centers shut down across the country because of VOCA cuts. And so thinking about the unique ways that institutions can be showing up for the community partners who make our work sustainable, thoughtful, and are often the ones who are helping to train us to use the lenses that we need to live our values. How can you be showing up financially, space, capacity, staffing, literally showing up, as Tanji was saying earlier, for both students and campus community partners. So thinking about the different resource sharing that can be activated. There is money in institutions. It's about whether we want to find it and use it. It may not be located in the centers that are doing this work, but we know that funding is there. So it's about leveraging the importance of that and how it ties back to our shared mission. The second thing is that coalition building, and interrelated, coalition building is critical if we want to see an end to sexual violence on an institutional and societal level. This means tying intention through a shared mission, framing the goals of a department or person that you want to work with your goal of ending sexual violence, preventing and supporting survivors once they've experienced harm. That also means that in other cases, we may need to be outlining why sexual assault is a hindrance to them achieving their mission. Sometimes the buy-in is, we have a shared goal. Sometimes the buy-in is, you're trying to get here. This is a barrier you're not recognizing, and I'm here to help you do that. I'm here to help you address so that you can achieve your mission and goal of why you're here in the first place. And then the last thing is that we're really at a critical point for campuses to decide if prevention and response is about compliance or about creating safer and healthier spaces. Investing in prevention, in addition to being about safety and well-being, is about academic excellence, is about retention, and is about innovation. And we need to be framing that for the folks who haven't been invited into spaces to be able to make those connections. Yes, we want safer and healthier campuses for our students, but by supporting the work of prevention and response, we are able to better create educational environments for academic excellence, for thought leadership that changes the world, and for retaining the students from diverse backgrounds who contribute to strong, healthy campus communities and further innovative thought that we wouldn't otherwise.
Just to add more to what Jennifer and Sarah mentioned, the buy-in for leadership is this common theme, and really, again, redefining what safety and well-being means for all students, especially students who are on the margins. I'm also thinking too, like investing in campus violence prevention programs and providing job security. So many centers are applying for grants, just like community organizations, and moving in a real grassroots kind of way with finding funding, being creative with funding, where institutions have the capacity and resources to support these programs. It's just way more about the intention and what is seen as most critical and necessary and needed. And unfortunately, that's not always the spaces where students can actually feel safe and comfortable, and we can move to a place of prevention. So we also know there's a lot of high turnover rates for folks who are working in violence prevention, and people should be paid a livable wage and feel like they're able to sustain and maintain themselves, especially the folks that are doing like helping work on college campuses. But I also believe that campuses are full of future prevention educators, advocates, and other folks who are working in this movement and have the potential to do work in this movement. And we can frame our work and the work that we do as necessary, viable, and worthy. I remember talking to some students after doing a film screening of I Am Evidence, and we were talking to nursing students about being forensic nurses and knowing that this work that we do, this movement work, is going to be constant, and we need more people to join us. A lot of us are moving, we're going to eventually move away from this work. We may not see some of the changes we want in our lifetime, but we can still offer students some preparation in the meantime. And already college campuses are a space where students, staff, and faculty are critically thinking. This is a space where we can look at root causes, we can start to put things into action, we can embrace creativity. And some of the biggest movements that we've seen have happened on college campuses. So I think about the Kent State protests, about the A&T Forest sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. I think about the creation of SNCC, but also movements to end sexual violence on campus. It is already happening, and students have always been in this process of being activists. And the best thing that we can do is welcome in students into the movement, amplify their voices, pay them, like Jennifer said, and also make their work be seen as part of a greater movement. So that is some ways I think that we can not rely on the master's tools in a lot of ways, but also organize with students and give them some tools for them to organize themselves.
Wow, thank you so much, Jennifer, Tanji, Sarah. This has been such a great conversation, and there will be a Q&A afterwards that's live, so please stay on. And yes, thank you again so much.